Good morning and welcome to the May 28th Committee of the Whole. I'll call this meeting to order at 9 o'clock and ask for a motion to approve the agenda. Would somebody like to move that? Moved by Deputy Mayor Nielsen, seconded by Councillor Dubik. Any questions, comments, or concerns? Seeing none. All those in favor of approving the agenda? That's carried. Item 3 on the agenda then would be a declaration of pecuniary interest. Should one arise, you could make us aware of it at that time. At this point, we'll move on to the items for consideration, which is our 2025 Asset Management Plan presentation. And I'll ask Director McCarthy to introduce the subject. Thank you.
Thank you and good morning, Council. So staff have been working closely with Hempson Consultants for the past year to update our asset management plan to meet the requirements of Ontario Regulation 588-17 by the July 1st deadline, and more importantly, to update our asset management financial plan to ensure our long-term sustainability. Hempson has also been working on our water and wastewater rate study in tandem, and there's alignment of these two major financial studies. At today's Committee of the Whole meeting, we're going to be receiving Hempson's high-level findings. The plan is for Council to receive the information, or you may provide further direction to Hempson or to staff. Following today's meeting, Hempson's going to prepare the asset management plan that will come back to Council on June 18th, and which will also be accompanied by a staff report, which may contain further options or recommendations. I'm pleased to introduce Christopher Baylett, Associate from Hempson Consulting. Christopher is a professional land economist and graduated with majors in statistics and economics. He rejoined Hempson in 2024 after working as a senior economist for the regional municipality of York. During the presentation, Christopher will stop after key sections of his presentation and ask for any questions or comments at that time.
Thank you very much. Good morning, members of council. So today we'll be going through the draft findings of the 2025 Asset Management Plan analysis, really focused on meeting the regulatory requirements for the proposed level of service. So I guess the next slide, please. So just a bit of an introduction. The asset management plan supports better decision-making on infrastructure investments. It is a very data-heavy exercise. We want to ensure that the data we are using the best data available as part of this exercise, and that's what we've done throughout the process and working with staff throughout this assignment. Several of the key things we want to ensure through the asset management plan is, we're ensuring long-term sustainability. So you'll see a set of financial findings later on in the presentation that aligns with sort of that objective. We want to make sure we're managing assets at the lowest cost of ownership. So in terms of when I say lowest cost, not necessarily the lowest cost, but the most efficient sort of cost throughout the analysis. We want to make sure we're minimizing risk associated to the infrastructure. We want to make sure that we're consistently enhancing service delivery over time. And at the end of the day, the document is intended to support council's decision making sort of going forward and provide information around that objective. Just next slide, please. So to give a bit of background in terms of the regulatory requirement, the municipality has met all the OREG 588-17 requirements to date. The regulation requires municipalities to undertake asset management plans, and there's a set of reporting requirements that the regulation wants. So up to 2024, your 2020 asset management plan really provided the information needed to meet those requirements. That said, the regulation does have one more requirement as part of this sort of timeline in 2025, due by July 1st of this year, and it is to develop the proposed level of service. So the proposed level of service refers to setting targets associated to the infrastructure that the municipality is managing. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that those targets are informed with the data that we have and the analysis that has been undertaken. And that needs to be done for all service areas and all asset categories. For the core services, there's a set of requirements that the regulation speaks to. There's a set of targets that they want want us to define. And for the non-core infrastructure, so I should say our core infrastructure is really related to our major engineering infrastructure, roads, bridges and culverts, water, wastewater, and stormwater, whereas our non-core infrastructure are all the other asset types, vehicles, machinery, equipment, and so on. We need to set level of service targets for all of those. For the non-cores, the municipality has the discretion to choose what targets can be set, and you'll see that over the next few slides. One more piece of information here in terms of post-2025 requirements. Just a few key things to remember. The municipality will need to do annual reporting on implementation of the asset management plan. So that's one requirement of the regulation. You just need to report what the progress is in implementing the asset management plan and any challenges with that progress. The big one is the asset management plan does need to be updated every 5 years after 2025. So your next update will be in 2030. It needs to be a whole update of that plan as per the reg requirement. So getting right into it, I'll stop probably in a couple slides for questions. So to start things off here in terms of the analysis, the municipality's asset portfolio is extensive and valued at $885 million. So a significant amount of infrastructure for a municipality your size, well approaching the $1 billion mark. To give that some context, the 2020 asset management plan identified about $191 million. So you can see it's a huge increase in terms of that replacement value. That said, not atypical of what the increases have been across municipalities in Ontario. There's been a significant increase in the cost of infrastructure. That's one of the major drivers here. The other driver is there is better data this time around. So there were assets that were not included as part of that 2020 asset management plan that are included now that have brought up that value a lot higher. So kind of two effects that are driving that increase. The majority of the infrastructure is related to roads. Not surprisingly, about 56%, so more than half of the infrastructure is related to the roads, followed up by your buildings, your bridges and culverts, and your water and wastewater infrastructure. And I will note that, like I mentioned, the data is a lot better this time around. We do have engineering estimates for unit costs for the linear infrastructure, so your roads, your water, wastewater, linear, as well as we've done benchmarking on, kind of replacement values for your buildings, kind of taking those from similar municipalities, your DC study, and as well as other documents. So we have done that benchmarking exercise to get a better feel of what that replacement value is. On the next slide, to put that replacement value into context, we want to look at the condition. Overall, the assets are in fair to good condition on average. So if you take the assets as a whole, overall, a relatively good news story on the condition side of things. Just about half of the assets are in good to very good condition, with about a quarter of them being in that middle sort of range in fair condition. There is still about a quarter or just under a quarter of the assets that are in sort of poor and very poor condition. And I do emphasize that this is a snapshot in time. Some of the conditions here are based on engineering reports and the information that we have, while others are based on an age-based approach. The older the asset, the sort of the worse the condition will be. That's just the sort of the nature of the data. So there's a mixed bag of approaches. Wherever the best data was available, we use that. I'll get into the financing strategy later, but one last point to make here is that in order to maintain these conditions, in order to maintain sort of these shares, there will be needed further investment into the future to make sure that we can maintain these shares sort of going forward. One last slide, and I'll stop for questions here. Really, what I want to emphasize here is that the main drivers of the overall condition are really going to be your highest valued assets. So what you see in the chart here is the breakdown of all the assets that we saw in the previous slide by their condition. Roads and related being the biggest chunk of the asset portfolio at 56% is really that big driver, and the majority of what you saw on the previous slide of the overall condition is driven by that. So you can see about half of the roads are in good to very good, but there's still a share, about a quarter, so they're in that fair condition range, and those are based on your engineering reports and the pavement condition index information. Your buildings overall and generally in fair or better condition, similar to bridges and culverts, which are informed by your engineering reports as well. You'll notice the water and wastewater has a bit of a bigger share in the red and orange. That's really related to the data. Once again, those are age-based conditions. So the older the asset, it'll fall into that red or orange bucket. So one of the key things in asset management is improvement over time. As the data gets better, we'll be able to assess that infrastructure as there's more further inspections on that infrastructure. We'll be able to update that information through the asset management plan model to ensure that that's more reflective of the conditions of the ground. The lowered value assets, sort of age-based as well, generally in fair condition. You'll notice a big red chunk in storm sewer. Once again, sort of a data thing, all based on age. So the infrastructure is quite old, so it'll get classified into that sort of very poor bucket. But keep in mind that makes up, about 1% or less of the overall asset portfolio. So nonetheless, even though they are lower valued assets, they are still needed and investment are still needed to support the other asset categories, particularly things like your vehicles, your equipment, and so on. They are used to support the maintenance of the other infrastructure. So continued investment is needed for all of these. And I'll get into that in detail a bit later. I guess that said, if council has any questions on what I've covered so far, I'd be happy to answer any of them, and then we can keep going after.
Thank you for that. So we'll pause at this point for questions. Any questions from council? Councillor Allen?
Thank you. Size of our municipality, 800 and something square kilometers and 11,000 people. And we've got 885 million. How do we compare to other municipalities? I guess not in size, because I think we're one of the larger in area. And also, how do we compare on the fair to good chart?
Thanks for that question.
Certainly,
turn
through the
to
chair. So in terms of the overall replacement value, I don't have the number on a per capita basis. I could get that number, but in terms of the overall replacement value, I would say it is in the range of municipalities your size. That big increase, like I mentioned, is driven by kind of two big factors. The biggest one being the inflation increases we've seen on hard infrastructure over the past 5 years, post pandemic. A lot of municipalities have seen this big increase, well over 50% increase in that infrastructure since the pandemic sort of started. The other one being the data component. There was a big data improvement this time around in terms of the assets that were included as part of this replacement value. That really brought up that value. So that doesn't necessarily mean your infrastructure changed. It's just what was actually recorded in the database itself.
Thank you for that. Any follow-up, Councillor Allen? Okay. Any other questions? Mayor McQueen and then Councillor Dubik, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so far for your presentation. You mentioned more immediate. I think you said $90 million, something you mentioned there a while back. Was there something mentioned there? You mentioned something about a more immediate attention. I think on the poorer side, is that what I think you will get something at 90 million or somehow you mentioned it anyway. So certainly our infrastructure is aging, but in reality, if 240,000 is 1% of our budget?
No.
140,000, sorry. 140,000 is 1% of our budget, sorry. Right? 140, right?
170.
Oh, it's 170 now. Pull that number at 170 is 1%. 10% increase is $1.7 million. That's far short of 90 million. My point is reality has to kick in here is what can be affordable from our residents. We just went through an overall budget increase, what, 9.2? Did I get that number right?
5.8 increase on the.
No, 9.2 overall was our.
Oh, yeah.
It was
blended
our
rate, yes.
Anyway, lots of numbers flying around, but like I look back and we have a lot of rural roads. Was it 800 some kilometers of roads altogether or somewhere, whatever that is. In the 60s, 50s and 60s, they brought them from a flat as that floor to raising those roads and then improving that infrastructure for snow removal and all that stuff. We've increased our gravel quality for a lot of those roads. I don't know when asphalt started to happen in this municipality or the municipalities before they're amalgamated, but probably in the 70s, moved to asphalt or hard surface road. My point is there's a lot there and that's just roads. So the reality is the expectation or to maintain what we have is going to be a challenge in that sense to what is the affordability on that sense as well. And, you know, when we first went down this road of asset management and doing our inventories and stuff, I was there when I was under the expectation that we would see funding from the province to see, okay, this is where your status is. To get more funding, there used to be block funding back in the 90s and all that stuff. It hasn't materialized to a certain degree. It just sort of puts it in an awareness that you need to putting money aside, no different than our water system or our sewage system where we had to do that, I don't know, 15 years ago now or whatever that was mandated. So we have the plan, you know, we need to invest it. And that's just roads, like there's not, we have four, you know, there's all this other infrastructure. So at some point, rubber's gonna hit the road. Of what we can actually expect or deal with or come up with the outside the box thinking. I don't sure which, and we know we're dealing with that, but you know, it's all good to have this nice plan and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not criticizing, I'm not being criticizing you. It's just the reality is if 170 is 1% and you raise your taxes over the next 10 years, 10% for 10 years, what is that, 11.7 million or whatever that number is, it's just, we would be hanging from trees.
We're gonna get some more financial information a little later in the presentation.
But I'm
we
just
can
saying in the
perhaps,
sense
yeah.
of
I think we all understand the issue that we've got a lot of assets and the dollar value of maintaining that level of service. And your asset management plan as was discussed during the
just bringing the
budget.
reality back to the table. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll just turn the floor over to Councillor Dubik for a question. Go ahead, Councillor Dubik.
Great, thank you. So thanks for coming in and really appreciate this conversation today because this is really pushing on the conversation about level of service. I'm just going to follow up on a question from Councillor Allen. So on slide 3, when we do talk about the 885 million, and this may not be available sort of right now, but I do wonder if there was an opportunity as a follow-up to gain information on a versus kind of other municipalities of our size and population. I think that's helpful just to give us a bit of a sense of how do we, what's our, because, you know, what we're trying to understand, I think, you know, in this presentation is, you know, what is our level of service, you know, for our community based on our, you know, sort of size, geographic size, because we're talking about roads and all, and population versus similar, you know, sort of municipalities. I think that would be really helpful as a follow-up. And then when we do take a, and what I think is really interesting here is, and maybe this is just a comment for now, is it's kind of like the double click as, you know, on slide 4 and 5, you know, because, you know, if once we do start talking and discussing level of service, then we have to start getting more specific about, you know, are we talking about buildings? Are we talking about you know, gravel roads versus asphalt roads, right? So that double click is going to be important to us as we get to, you know, specific buildings, specific, you know, roads, asphalt, gravel, etc., so that we can then start to make, I would say, level of service decisions, because we're going to have to make it at an asset level. And I don't know if, you know, as we continue on with this work, you know, if we can then have sort of that, you know, as we start to have that conversation, you know, obviously you've built this from ground up. If we could, if needed, as we can, you know, kind of have this conversation, you know, get more double click information as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And just to clarify a point, if we want to establish what 1% of the levy is, it's not 170,000, it's 155, I think, but the treasurer could give us that number if you need the exact number. Madam Treasurer, could you?
Thank you. Through you, 1% of the levy is 181,000.
181,000.
Yeah.
There you go.
And just if I could. If I could respond to Councillor Dubik. This is just the high level findings, but the report that will be coming in June will contain the detail. So it will include all the information you're looking for.
Councillor, go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay,
Wickens.
Chair Tom, that's okay. So we see our wastewater and our storm sewers. Just, is the data just based on age alone, or have there been any actual inspections, like camera inspections done of it?
Oh, I can start through the chair. So currently the majority of the data on water and sewer is based on age. So the older the infrastructure, it'll fall into that bucket. Maybe I'll have to refer to staff if there's been any cameras.
Through you, Chair, to Councillor Wickens. So a lot of this data was gathered from some of our studies, so it would have been the road management plan, any other studies of that sort that would have the age. A lot of this is based on age. The updated information that Chris is referring to would have came from projects that we've already completed recently, so we know that the age of that particular one. So getting towards roads, we have been doing some base improvements on those sections of roads. Those are all included, which Chris had identified, updated information. So as we progress through the process, hence it has that ability to pull out that information. So we're not grouping the roads particularly into one broad brush, if you will. They're all individual assets out through the concessions. Bridges is the same. We have those annual inspections, the BCI reports. I'm assuming building, we just recently did the condition indexing or the ratings on the facility. So I'm hoping that answers your question.
Yeah, if I might, yeah.
Go
Yeah,
ahead,
just
Councillor.
like when you inspect the bridges, it's hands-on and you know, stuff like that. So when we've done some replacement in the storm or the wastewater, we've seen the actual degradation or whatever you want, yeah.
Go
Through
ahead,
you,
Director
Chair
McCarthy.
Elwood. Our water and our wastewater infrastructure, those are mainly age-based data as well as the storm sewers, just because it would be so expensive to camera all of
Yeah.
that underground infrastructure. So the majority is age-based,
Yeah.
which is considered the least reliable.
Yeah, it's a lot more expensive to dig it up and find it's okay. Thanks.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much, Chair Elwood. Just a question, if I may, just to help me quantify the age base. So can you just quantify that is, good condition, 1 to 3 years, and then very good is, you know what I mean? Can you quantify that for me? And where does poor lies at 30 years plus, 40 years plus? If you can just help me understand, as we keep saying age base, it'll be a bit better.
Go ahead.
Certainly. Yeah, so in terms of quantifying or the conversion from the age, it's based as a percentage of the useful life. So 20% or less remaining of the useful life, it would fall into the very poor, whereas 80% or more of remaining useful life would be a very good. And then everything else sort of in between in increments of 20.
Go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
So just to follow up, an asset like a road that has a useful life of 15 years or something like that, then it gets quantified down. Can anybody help me understand what the useful life of a sewer drain is?
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess to clarify, for anything where it's where we have to come up with an age-based condition, it's based on those parameters. Wherever we actually have condition information, particularly for the roads, the buildings and the bridges and culverts, there's just a conversion for the roads, the PCI to a good to very good. And that one is a little different. It doesn't follow the 20 incremental. It follows more of anything kind of lower than 50 or 60 would fall into that poor or very poor, because it uses sort of the deterioration curve to come up with that condition. So wherever we're using actual conditions from an engineering report to convert them into the 5-tier scale, it's more reflective of the actual deterioration of the infrastructure. Wherever it's age-based, it uses the more simpler approach.
Just to clarify my question, 20% of useful life is useless to me unless I know what the useful life of the item is. So what I'm asking for is on something like our sewer drains, where we're saying 75% of those assets are in very poor condition. as well as saying we are strictly going on age-based because as to what Councillor Wickens said, we're not going to dig it up and we can't camera every kilometer of it. What I'm trying to get is, what is the actual number of the age that we're starting with that then tells me I understand what you're giving me numbers.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's fair. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's 50 or greater. It's something like that. It depends on the asset. But these assets, the water and wastewater infrastructure, are very long lived. So they're some of the highest useful lives here. Yep.
Okay. Okay, I'll go back to Councillor Dubik.
Thank you. Maybe just want to ask another question and follow up about the wastewater and the water infrastructure because, you know, that is our user rate payers. And that can be a little concerning, you know, when you see that. So what are the main, do we have sort of in terms of that per section? You know, so those per buckets for wastewater infrastructure and water infrastructure, can we specifically state what that is? Like, so for example, is that the Kimberly Amick facility? Thank you.
Those are, so we can outline which assets those are. What we can do is outline them in sort of through the asset management report or provide them separately to council. Like we can provide all the detail of what falls into that category. Yeah.
Okay. Seeing no more questions, then we'll move on with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So on the next slide, we get right into the level of service, and these next couple slides might answer some of the questions that we had a bit earlier. So the proposed level of service requires a set of defined criteria or some criteria in order to come up with those numbers. We want to make sure that we consider the options and associated risks with the level of service. We want to make sure that we measure the difference between the proposed level of service or the target relative to what the current actual level of service is. And then two important components. We want to make sure that those levels of service are achievable and that they're affordable. And you'll see a set of, in the next few slides where we'll go through the level of service and then we'll talk about the financing strategy. In the financing strategy, there's two sets of numbers. One, the ideal world scenario, and one, the level of service scenario, the more realistic scenario. So we'll go through that in detail over the next couple slides here. We cover a summary of the proposed level of service relative to the current. So what you see here are a snapshot of the core levels of service. So those required by the regulation to be tracked. For the paved roads, the first one, the average pavement condition index is 75. So that PCI on a scale from 0 to 100 based on your engineering reports is at a 75. In terms of if we wanted some context, 75 is on sort of on the higher end. It's a relatively good condition for as an average. The proposed level of service, and you'll see that quite frequently here, is really to maintain that level of service. We want to make sure that the overall conditions on average are maintained for the road network. For the unpaved roads, a little bit of a different approach. They are in fair condition on average, so sort of that mid-range. Once again, a little bit less information on the gravel roads, but that's just the nature of gravel roads. You know, you go through a summer and then gravel roads are a completely different condition. This is a snapshot in time in terms of the gravel roads. That said, we want to make sure we maintain that overall level of service, making sure that those gravel roads on average overall are maintained in that fair range. For the bridges and culverts, once again, an engineered approach in terms of what that bridge condition index is based on your OSIM reports, which are required to be completed every 2 years. On average, the bridges are at 64, and then the culverts are on average at 73. In terms of the proposed level of service, the proposed level of service is to maintain a minimum average of 60. So making sure that, you know, like overall as a weighted average, those are 60 and above. That said, we want to make sure that we're prioritizing any structures that are under 50. Those are the critical infrastructure that needs to be addressed. And that's generally informed through your OSIM reports that are completed every 2 years. On the next slide, some more of the snapshot of those levels of service. The top ones there are also related to the core infrastructure, particularly for the stormwater system. The first one is the percentage of properties in the municipality resilient to a 100-year storm, and the second one being the municipal stormwater management system resilient to a 5-year storm. This is one of those areas, once again, where there are data gaps in understanding what this level of service actually is. It's a very tricky level of service to come up with, and not uncommon to not have the data, especially for municipalities your size. That said, in sort of conversations with your engineering staff, the current level of service is in that range of 60 to 80%. Like I mentioned, a high level estimate of the resiliency to those 100-year storms. That said, maintaining that current level of service is going to be important through, maintenance of that stormwater infrastructure. But that said, kind of one of the future kind of improvement recommendations here would be to have a future engineering study to determine what that value actually is, because some of the infrastructure is older. There isn't, kind of records to determine if it's actually the capacity of that infrastructure. An engineer needs to come in and sort of determine that. But that is a future improvement recommendation as part of this exercise. For the resiliency to a 5-year storm, generally most of the infrastructure would be resilient to a 5-year storm, and particularly obviously any newer stormwater infrastructure in your new development areas and so on. But similar approach, maintaining that current level of service, ensuring that stormwater infrastructure is maintained, and a future engineering study perhaps to come up with a more grounded number for that. Some of the other measures here, buildings on average are in good condition. So based on the BCA reports, the reporting shows us that those buildings are in relatively good condition. And we want to make sure we're targeting fair or higher condition for our buildings, particularly any buildings that are front facing, things like your administration center or your libraries and so on, like anything where residents are using those facilities. For the water and wastewater services, some other measures required by the regulation: water main breaks, water boil advisories, wastewater backups, and effluent violations, all currently zero. So there hasn't been any of those major events that have occurred over the past few years. We want to make sure we maintain that target of zero. And I will note, this is where the data, like to the point on the data, you saw that a lot of some of that infrastructure is age-based on the water and wastewater. It falls in the red, but regardless of that, the system is maintained in good condition, mainly because of this measure here. You can see that these haven't been occurring over the past few years. The expectation is with current future investment on the water and wastewater infrastructure, that will remain to be the case. And we'll talk about the rates a little bit later today, the water and wastewater rates. For all the other asset categories, so your non-cores, vehicles, equipment, machinery, and so on, generally the proposed level of service is to maintain the level of service at fair or better. And that is something that the municipality has already been doing. Vehicles come up for replacement, equipment comes up for replacement, or it breaks down, it gets replaced in order to continue to use it. But that said, it requires continued investment onward into the future. The next few slides cover the financials of this. So I want to tie it back to the level of service here. And you'll see some pretty big numbers here, but as well as the level of service is more tapered down. So bear with me as I go through this sort of the section here. So managing the infrastructure does require a set of life cycle activities to be undertaken. So when we say life cycle activities in the asset management world, is all the work that you do through your capital program, through your operating, through maintenance, and so on. The life cycle activities are really related or defined sort of there. Things like non-infrastructure solutions, which are generally associated to management of the assets, so not work directly on the infrastructure, but how you manage it. Expansion activities, typically your growth-related infrastructure. Maintenance activities, any activities related to maintenance, typically captured through your operating budget. Renewal, rehabilitation, and replacement, which are the big ticket items on the capital side. Replacing vehicles or renewing or rehabilitating roads are the sort of the big ticket items on those two categories. And disposal activities, any activities related to disposing of an asset, sometimes buried in the other two categories there. So in total, the total life cycle activities or the life cycle costs over the next 10-year period is about $245.8 million. And these are the costs associated to management of the infrastructure in an ideal world. So in a world with no funding constraints, this is what it would cost in order to be able to manage all that infrastructure, replace it on time, repair it on time, and so on. And this, the sort of the reason we come up with this is on the next slide, in terms of understanding what we call the benchmark funding gap. So we define two funding gaps. This is the first one, the second one being the level of service funding gap. The benchmark funding gap reflects the financials around that 245.8 million, the ideal world scenario. So what you see there is the 10-year forecasted funding with about $81.4 million over 10 years. That's made up of your continued contributions to reserve in the 2025 budget of about 3.2 million, so maintaining that constant over the period, as well as some other assumptions on grants and other funding sources for capital. We have CCBF, so formerly the gas tax, about 342,000 per year over the 10-year period. We have the OCIF over 5 years. So the OCIF, we don't consider that necessarily a sustainable funding source. So we continue that over 5 years as opposed to 10. And we've also included your existing capital reserves, about 5.4 million. And we've also inclusive of operations and maintenance costs, back to sort of the life cycle operations and maintenance funding, from your operating budget, and as well as any debt payments that you're making that are funded from tax. We consider that as a part of your fiscal capacity as part of your tax levy. So 245.8, and I'm sure you're doing the math already, 80 minus 81.4, that leaves a gap of about $164.4 million over that 10-year period. So a significant number. To put that into context, in order to close that gap over the 10-year period, would require 20% tax levy increases over the 10-year period. So that's about $3.7 million every year and onward. So before I guess scare council here with these numbers, I like to emphasize once again, this is part of the baseline analysis, what we call the benchmark gap. This is the ideal world scenario where we can replace all our infrastructure on time based on its useful life. And it's important that we use this benchmark gap in order to assess the level of service. The level of service is tapered down on the next slide, but this gap is more comparable to perhaps some of the exercises you've done in the past through your asset management plan. So the capital expenditure needs to meet the proposed level of service, however, are lower than the benchmark. So the chart here shows the 10-year cumulative benchmark needs. So these are the needs for each of the asset categories in green from the benchmark from the previous slide versus the need to meet the proposed level of service. And you can see that the green is significantly higher, particularly for roads, bridges, and culverts. So we're talking about the tax-funded services here. But the proposed level of service needs are significantly lower. So you can see that the roads and related bridges and culverts are quite lower than what the benchmark would suggest. For vehicles, relatively the same, as vehicles are sort of replaced on a replacement schedule. For buildings aren't necessarily replaced over time. They are very long-lived assets, but they are repaired or rehabilitated over time. That's reflected in the decrease there. And similar for equipment, storm sewers, and you can't really see the trails. It's a really small sort of bar there, but similar approach in terms of what the proposed level of service is. So the next slide for the tax-funded services, the gap associated to meeting the proposed level of service is instead 36.5 million. And what we're comparing here is the adjusted life cycle costs over the 10-year period. So it has come down from our total of 245.8 million down to 117.8 million. And that's compared to the 81.4 million in funding that we saw in the previous slides. So that gap, 36.5 million. In order to address that particular gap over the 10-year period would require increases of to the tax levy for capital of $810,000 per year. So that would be $810,000 every year over the next 10-year period. $810,000 is about 4.5% of the $18.1 million 2025 tax levy. I'll do one more slide to put that into context and I'll stop for sort of questions. So on the next slide, to put that $810,000, we want to make sure that council understands what that means in terms of the actual contribution. So the current tax funding contribution is in and around that $3.5 million mark in 2025. So that's the tax funded contribution from the tax levy. That $810,000 will need to be done every year over the next 10 years. So that contribution by 2034 is just over $10 million. So those are the funds needed to close that gap in the previous slide to meet that proposed level of service requirements. So not inconsequential. One last thing to note here is that, that 110,000 is spread out over that 10-year period. If we were to hold the line, for example, in any given year, we would need to make sure that we're making up the difference in the year after in order to make sure we're maintaining that level of service. So holding the line would make the sort of the yellow bars that you see here smaller, but then we would have to make up the difference in later years. So at the end of the day, we're funding sort of the same amount with a little bit of different timing in between. So with that said, maybe I'll stop there for questions, if council would like to have.
Thank you. I'll turn the floor over for questions. Councillor Dubik.
Thank you. So just a question about water and wastewater infrastructure. So when I take a look at slide 11, so it's not teased out there. Could you just provide some context about that? Thank you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
So right up to the slides I just presented are just the tax funded services, so not the water and wastewater infrastructure. So I have a slide on the water and wastewater infrastructure separate. The reason they're separate is because they have different funding sources. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Deputy Mayor Nielsen, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair Elwood. So just confirming for myself, the difference, the proposed level of service totals. This is going back to the earlier slide that showed your 75 on roads and 60% on bridges and that kind of thing. To maintain that level of service, this is the $117.8 million or the 4.5% increase per year. The benchmark model would be if we were to try to maintain Great Highlands at a good position across all of our infrastructure needs, and that's the difference in the way these are calculated, correct?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in theory, if the municipality was to undertake the benchmark, it would probably result in a higher level of service. Yeah.
Any further questions at this point? Councillor Dubik.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand, when we think about the ideal benchmark versus our proposed, so a different level of service, and I'm just trying to understand in my mind, like, what does that actually look like, feel like, mean? Like, so I appreciate, we have the slides up above. So I guess that's like slide 7 and slide 8. Where we state those proposed versus current. I guess I'm just wondering, what does that feel like in real life?
Go ahead, sir.
So it's so I appreciate, doing the ideal benchmark is a real stretch. And I'm just wondering what that quality of life, in terms of that, the proposed level.
Yeah, I can certainly comment on that. We don't have a quantification of the exact what the benchmark would yield, but what the benchmark reflects, like I mentioned, is really the replacement of the infrastructure on time. So if an asset has a 10-year useful life or 20, 30, whatever it is, right at 30 years, it would be replaced. But in addition to that, any of the backlog based on that useful life, so anything that's over its design life would be considered as part of that backlog. That backlog, in theory, and the benchmark would also be addressed. So what that would result in is an immediate increase in the overall conditions of the infrastructure. So if you think about the pie that we saw earlier, if in theory we were to undertake those costs, a lot of that infrastructure, a bigger share of it would be in good condition.
Don't see any further questions at this point, so perhaps we'll move on with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. So just have a couple slides left here on the rate supported infrastructure. So as we mentioned earlier, we are undertaking the water and wastewater rate study as an independent exercise. But that said, both of these kind of documents speak to each other. Meeting the proposed level of service for the rate funded services is actually more is not as big as the tax funded services, not atypical of your municipality and other municipalities. So in order to meet the proposed level of service, it's really the recommendation from the rate study. Back in September, the draft rates were presented to council. They proposed a 5.5% average increase on water and wastewater combined. Maintaining that increase would meet the proposed level of service of ensuring that the infrastructure has no water main breaks, no effluent violations, and so on, making sure that the infrastructure continues to be sustainable over the next 10-year period. So this does tie back to what has been proposed in the capital program through the rate study directly, and that would be the scenario needed to meet the proposed level of service. So that's that 5.5% increase consistent with the rate study sort of results. So in terms of can maybe one more slide here just to kind of round this off. At the end of the day, the approaches to closing the funding gap are limited. This is not unique to the municipality. It's the same situation in many other municipalities. We kind of emphasize here, continuing to seek funding support from upper levels of government is something that the municipality has continued to do through grant applications, through your OSIF, which recently had to be reported on the replacement values and so on. But that said, we don't consider funding from upper levels of government to be a sustainable funding source. The upper levels of government, the feds and the province changes the rules frequently. So we want to make sure that we are sustaining the infrastructure in a sustainable way. So the next one here is really increased investment in infrastructure. Funding sources for municipalities are limited. As you saw, there's a tax levy increase needed to meet that proposed level of service that we saw in the previous slides. That said, some other components that are important, improve data quality and that measure against the level of service. So just as the conversation earlier, we saw some infrastructure based on age. As better information becomes available over time, asset management is not a one and done thing. There'll need to be improvements to the data over time as that data comes in. That data quality might show better conditions for some of that infrastructure, particularly for the water and wastewater. That'll help the situation or the sort of the findings and the numbers here, and making sure that there's implication, there's risks associated to the level of service. Declines in levels of service are obviously going to be affecting those who use the infrastructure as well. And just a final small one, continued coordination with the county, of course, if there's any coordination on projects, roads or water and sewer projects, and finding efficiencies there might be possible. Although a minor thing or minor efficiencies, it is certainly something that the municipality does and should continue to do. So with that said, the final point here is really the regulation does require council to adopt an asset management plan by July 1st, 2025. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at the findings. But that said, I'd be happy to take any other questions you may have or any comments, and we'll take that back to incorporate as part of the asset management plan report.
Thank you for that. Again, I'll open the floor for questions at this point. Councillor Allen.
Thank you. So going back to the rating on the wastewater and storm sewers, and it's because of their age that they're rated poorly. And then there was also that line that said we haven't had any water main breaks. So is there an adjustment? Can that, poor be adjusted up to a fair based on that? And then also useful life. Obviously, if assets are properly maintained, a vehicle that's supposed to last 7 years, I just got rid of 2 vehicles that were 13 years old. If they're maintained properly, is there any kind of adjustment for that? And finally, what is the government using this information for? The data that we present, do they use that to determine funding for Grey Highlands? So, are we better to make it, is it better to make the report look good that those water and sewers are actually in better shape? Or should we say, yeah, those things, they all need to be replaced, give us money? Questions in there.
I think there were several questions there, but I'll turn the floor back to our consultant. Go ahead.
Sure. So I guess the first one being on the adjustment to the level of service. So it's tricky. The level of service for the water and wastewater, those are detailed. Staff and as well as the annual water reports have that information in it. That needs to be reported every year. Kind of regulatory requirements reported to council as well. So there's good information on, have there been the water main breaks? We're sure of that. But what we're not sure is the actual condition of the infrastructure. So it's tricky to take that number and make an assumption on the infrastructure. We also want to make sure we're not overstating the condition of the infrastructure because we may miss something. We'd rather be more conservative and say, some of the infrastructure in our database is a little bit in poor condition. We should monitor it as opposed to saying it's in good condition and perhaps it falls to the wayside. So that's sort of the approach there. It doesn't have a clear kind of quantifiable connection, but that's the way we're thinking about the water and wastewater a bit of at a high level.
Was there a follow-up, Councillor Allen? Did I answer your questions?
Just waiting for the other two.
So on the vehicle, so you are right that, good maintenance of the vehicles will ensure that that vehicle meets its design life objectives. In general, vehicles are kind of rolling stock. They do have sort of a finite life. They do have warranties that expire. So all those factors, that's why it has more of a design life component to it. Generally, they have like a useful life of 7, 10, 15, depending on the type of vehicle. So we kind of stick to that design life in general. It's hard to say how much it's going to be used. It's hard to say if a vehicle gets into an accident. It's certainly something we can't forecast. So for that reason, for the life cycle cost analysis, we tend to stick to what that design life is and sticking to that sort of replacement schedule. But that said, without that maintenance, that vehicle won't be able to reach that design life at all. So if a vehicle has a 10-year design life, it's not maintained properly, it certainly won't reach that 10-year design life at all.
Any follow-up to that answer? I believe you were using the vehicle as an example of maintaining any of our assets, so.
Yeah, the building assessment or building condition report that we got a few years ago, and I'll bring up the one that I brought up at the time. There's a pavilion in Flesherton that it's got a steel roof and the useful life was, let's say 15 years. And it's been on like 13, but it still looks like new. So all these numbers are skewed. I shouldn't say all of them, but some of them are skewed because things aren't wearing out as fast as the useful life says they should. So it's a little frustrating to get a report that says you need to replace that roof, and yet anybody can see that it's okay. I guess I'm just venting here right now. I don't need you to respond, but
Go ahead, Director McCarthy.
Through you, Chair Alwood. I think that's why this exercise has been very valuable because it does provide the two scenarios. So if we look at the BCA results from several years ago, that would be the benchmark scenario, right? Where we were doing everything as soon as the useful life is over with, regardless of the actual condition. So the second results that were just presented take into account real actual scenarios and decisions that staff would make when it was time to replace.
And that we'll see that when we get the full report.
Yeah. Yes, further details will be in that report. Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, and just to clarify on just to clarify that point on the data, I know I mentioned the vehicles. The approach for each of the assets are different. For example, for buildings, like you mentioned, you're not going to rip up the building just because it hit its design life. You're going to repair or rehabilitate those components, and that's what's reflected in the proposed level of service. To the treasurer's point, there is that element already built into it that those assets are long-lived. It's the same for roads, and it's the same for the bridges and culverts. The bridges and culverts are based on the recommendations from the OSIM report. Bridges and culverts, some culverts need to be replaced, others can be repaired based on those recommendations. recommendations, and then the roads as well, based on sort of the engineered reporting as well. It's not proposed in here to rip up the whole road and replace it. It's being proposed to rehabilitate it based on whatever that condition was assessed by the engineers.
Councillor Allen? I just wonder if we could, any asset management plan, the level of service, risk, achievability, and affordability are the key components of your asset management plan. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about risk and what it means to the councillors that are making decisions on our asset management plan.
Certainly. So we saw the recommendation of the sort of the increased funding need to meet that proposed level of service objective. Like I mentioned sort of earlier, the contributions to reserve or further contributions to reserve are needed in order to maintain that infrastructure or maintain that condition pie that you saw in sort of the previous slide. Sort of holding the, in an example or in a world where we held the line, where we didn't have that funding source, over time, that infrastructure will continue to deteriorate. You'll have less funds to repair, rehabilitate facilities, or replace sort of vehicles. So that average condition, those numbers that you saw, will start to decline. It may not happen next year. It may not happen in year 3, but certainly the longer the time goes that we don't have those contributions available, that those conditions will start to decline. And some infrastructure, while it's in good condition today, may not be deteriorating as fast, but as time goes on, it deteriorates a little faster. So these are effects over time, of course. It does take time, but missing sort of a contribution in 1 year means that we have to increase that contribution a lot higher in future years in order to make up sort of the difference. So there is a cost implication over the long term. Infrastructure is getting more expensive as well, like you saw. And we don't see an indication that it's going to slow down. The non-residential construction price index has come back down in and around that 3% and 4%, but that's still much higher than CPI, of course. So just keep, those are kind of the key points here to remember. Kind of delaying some of this makes things more expensive in the future.
Okay, Councillor Dubik, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Dubik.
Okay, thank you. So when I take a look at the presentation, I do pause on slide 7 and slide 8, where we talk about our level of service, our proposed level of service, because this really drives, these are the key assumptions that drive the numbers of what do we feel we need to be putting away every year to ensure the level of service. And this is more of a comment, but and this is, I think, important for, us as council, to make sure we're comfortable with. But what we're saying here, and when we take a look at all the, the current level of service versus proposed, like in a nutshell, it really is just keeping current level of service. So to me, I think what this really means is the expense to maintain our infrastructure has increased, and it goes back to that, I think that first slide of the, the 2020 number versus, the current number. So with better data, there's also been over 5 years, there's been inflation, et cetera. So, so it is a larger increase in terms of the total dollar portfolio. And what we're doing is we're really maintaining our current level of service. But it's just the dollar amount to just maintain this, it has increased. Is that fair?
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. As time goes on, the cost to maintain and to rehabilitate and repair and so on infrastructure is increasing. So that is one of the drivers here in terms of what the life cycle analysis shows. The replacement value itself is, I guess, two points to make. It is a reporting requirement as part of this exercise. And we have, like I mentioned, there's better information to that. So that's one component that drives this, not necessarily the market itself. It's sort of a data component, but there is an influence on that replacement value onto the life cycle costs, especially for assets that are actually being replaced. things like vehicles, machinery, and even components in your buildings that may need to be replaced over time, things like AC units and things like that, that have a certain finite life. All those things are reflected in the replacement value. The replacement value is kind of an underlying assumption as part of the life cycle analysis. If that goes up, the life cycle costs also go up over a longer time period, of course.
I have Deputy Mayor and then, or a follow-up first for you, Councillor Lubick.
If I may just make just another comment, just to Councillor Allen's point about, Soren, if you take a look at a shed that, in the roof of the shed, the life of that may be longer, but it also counterbalances surprises like, Kimberly Hall, right? That became a very big cost to us. And so it's, I think when we take a look at a whole portfolio, we can see things that may last longer, but then things also may deteriorate faster. And so as a portfolio, it's, these things sort of balance out, and it's always more trickier to do it as a portfolio, but there are counterbalances.
I mean, it is a portfolio, but it's also a snapshot in time. Things change. Okay, Deputy Mayor, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair Elwood. I got a couple points here that I've written down that I wanted to make. To Councillor Allen's comment about the benchmark and the BCA studies coming in. I appreciate the chair bringing up risk. As a homeowner, when you're looking at your assets or the roof of your house or something, you may be willing to take a greater risk because of finances or situation or whatever, or you don't think, like a lot of homeowners may not think about the roof until there's a problem. And so as a municipality, when we're looking at level of service, we're trying to maintain our assets so that they are open and usable for the public good. And so in some of those assets, it's the road base and making sure that when we have somebody driving down that road, that there isn't a risk that there's going to be a pothole open up or some damage to their vehicle or something. So that risk component is something that we really need to consider when it comes to what our comfort level is. And I know our CAO isn't here at the moment, but she'd be preaching risk management fulsomely. So that's one point I want to make. Councillor Dubik brought up the other big point I wanted to bring up, which was the level of service. And we're going through this asset management exercise, and there's a level of service kind of defined in here, but council hasn't, other than no change, I guess, because there hasn't been direction to change level of service, we haven't been able to have a conversation to say, as we review this 5-year asset management plan, is this a time to review our levels of service? We do have a staff report requested for looking at, when do we convert an asphalt road into a gravel-based road? As we made that decision because level of service and cost and asset management is something that's driving harder decisions. And if we look around at our neighbors and our neighboring municipalities, Chatsworth just had the discussion, decided to postpone the plan to build a new arena because of the cost that might bring and the cost for rebuilding. So there isn't really a moment here and now to have that asset management conversation, because it's not something where council can decide or should decide flippantly. Like, I will admit that we did during the budget cycle and making that decision on converting a road. And then we do need to have those staff reports comes that council can give the direction on what kind of level of service we're moving forward. And so when we look at this asset management plan and the suggestion of the 4.5% increase that seems to be coming in the next report, I guess this is the precursor to warn us so that we don't get scared when we see the next report. That is the big part of whether that 4.5% gets implemented. And if we look back at this council table and the last asset management plan and the 1.5%, I believe it was the initial amount we were supposed to be putting into our asset management plan year over year. And I know last term of council, we kind of actually implemented a 1% increase. And so we didn't even meet the last one. And then we're seeing a 4.5% this asset management plan coming. And that kind of has concerns where if we don't maintain that, what does the next 5 year? So question for staff is on how do we as a council maybe better prepare for that discussion on levels of service? Is there direction that council needs to give to staff, similar to the report we're asking on, you know, conversion of roads, to help us understand levels of service or break that down?
Director McCarthy?
Thank you, through you. That's not there's no easy answer to that. I know that specifically for our facilities, we have had lots of conversations around the levels of service. And no decision has been made to actually change the levels of service. So I guess staff worked closely with Hemson to determine what the proposed levels of service would be to inform this plan. And assuming that there were no changes in our actual asset base, because there's been no decision or direction provided in that sense for any of the asset classes. So the proposed levels of service, as mentioned, are really to maintain what we're already doing, which is to replace assets at the right time, to keep them in a good condition as possible. If we want to have more information, I guess, specifically about the proposed levels of service that staff have worked with on Hemson, that certainly will be included in the full asset management report. And council might like to see some changes to the proposed levels of service, either up or down, which could change the final results of the plan and the financial recommendation. But unless council has specific direction to provide, I guess, surrounding what they would like to see, then that's, I know there's still some reports pending for various departments to come to council, but there's no direction at this point to inform the plan.
Follow-up.
Just a follow-up on the last point I had written down that I didn't bring up, and thank you very much, Director McCarthy. It is challenging as we have these discussions, and the pressure that is on council from the community to maintain levels of service or to improve levels of service while we sit here at council and look at the actual financial costs. One of the notes I had to myself is that there's the proposed increases to level of service. So we have new subdivisions getting built that have an increase to our demand and to our asset base, but in the increase in the asset base also comes with an increased level of service. And we saw that through this budget cycle where we had to increase the trackless, the track sidewalk plow for Markdale, because frankly, there's just more sidewalks than there used to be. And so as we see the growth, we're also going to see that increase. And we also have community drive and interest into seeing increase in recreational assets, be it the splash pad that's coming or being talked about, the new park in Maxwell, the new pickleball court in Flusherton. These are levels of service that are going to increase and have an impact on this as well. And so I think that's something that when we're looking at the next phase of this, which is, you know, we're going to receive the staff report in the next 40 days and have to make that decision on it. Are we implementing it? That's the kind of the easy decision. That the actual, as our mayor alluded to, the rubber is going to meet the road when it comes to budget time, and what are we actually willing to invest into the assets and try to maintain or try to work with our community to improve. So just not a question there, Chair, but thank you for the time to speak.
Okay, Councilor Wickens, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Alwood. So just a quick question on slide 11. It's down there at vehicles and to maintain our proposed level of service. It says we're going to spend over $20 million in the next 10 years. Is that just pickups and cars and stuff like that? I'm hoping it's not. I hope that it's graders and trucks and.
That's all vehicles. Yeah, so it's all the vehicles in the inventory. So not just pickup trucks. It's all your.
Thank goodness, because if I told my constituents we're going to spend $22 million cars and pickups in the next 10 years.
All getting company deal.
Yeah,
Fire trucks,
Okay.
apparently.
that makes a little more sense then. Yeah. All right, that's all.
Thank you. I had a question. You know, the roads are obviously a huge part of our assets that we're maintaining. We have minimum standards that we that the municipality is regulated to uphold. So that level of service, the current level of service, we're meeting that goal, I assume, or meeting or bettering that goal. And, but, these are decisions that, fall beyond this group of council, making, choices when it comes to minimum standards and things like that.
Yeah, to your point, the proposed level of service meet the minimum maintenance standards. So they are something the municipality is already doing, required by regulation, the province, obviously.
Yeah.
But in terms of it goes in terms of the levels of service that are required by the regulatory requirement, which is reporting on that PCI. Maintaining that PCI has that minimum maintenance starts built into that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Deputy Mayor?
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Another question that I had written down and I forgot about it for a second there. The county's asset management plan tends towards the funding rather than reserves. In the past, and even today, you've mentioned like maintaining the increase into our level of reserves. Can you help me understand like a difference of methodology and in our situation where we have so many assets that are already kind of, I guess, behind the eight ball in terms of that snapshot in time. Is there a necessity to continue to build up the reserve? We're over 3.5 million in there versus not put the money into the reserve, keep the reserve that's there for the emergency usage, and then increasing the actual expenditure year over year as a different way of tackling asset management. Can you just kind of explain the two different ways of doing things and the reason behind both different ways?
Certainly. So reserves are important in order to mitigate potential tax impacts in any given year. The savings in those reserves can be used if a particular project comes up or emergency happens. That's going to be where you're going to draw your reserves in order to address that particular capital need. The other thing is the reserves are also savings for the long-term repair, rehabilitation, or replacement of infrastructure. So having those reserves is also important for that longevity and making sure there's a sustainable funding source or savings available beyond kind of the longer period and beyond this 10-year planning period as well. The alternative of sort of funding and I guess to make the point here, we have considered the reserves as part of the funding available to undertake some of this work in the 10-year period as well. So we have taken into consideration what you've already been doing. So we haven't forgotten about that. It's built into that funding gap as well. The other method would be kind of in-year funding, where as the capital projects come up, you'll need to put funding towards those particular projects. Some municipalities do undertake that method. That said, there is risk that there are particularly large projects that may come up, and you may not be able to kind of bring forward a significant tax levy increase in order to do that. So that's why those reserves are very important in order to be able to have those funds available for those big tax impacts. One last point on this sort of planning period. So the assets are very long-lived, like we've said. The regulation wants us to look at a 10-year window, but that doesn't mean we've forgotten about beyond the 10-year. There are still cost obligations beyond that 10-year period. Some of the costs included in here, think about what's beyond that 10-year period, because we can't just fund the 10-year and expect those levels of service to be maintained after the 10-year as well. We look at the 10-year window, but we are considering that point too. So there are some savings in here for future repair and rehabilitation beyond that 10-year. So our analysis is over 40 years, but we look at the 10-year just for that reg requirement.
Thank you for that. Any follow-up? Any further questions from council? I missed the mayor leaving.
Yeah, to take a call.
Okay. Councilor Wickens.
Yeah, just so kind of clear this up for me. So slide 13 is closing the gap. So it says we need to add $810,000 per year to reach our asset management goals. So if we add 810,000 this year, just for easy figuring, let's say $1 million this year. So that carries over to the next year and we bump another $1 million on top of that. So now it's 2 million plus the 1 million. Is that, so is that every year we're carrying that, whatever that's, what I'm trying to say, is it compounding every year? It's not just adding that extra 810,000 a year. It's gonna be plus, plus, plus.
That's exactly right. It's
Yeah.
compounding, it's cumulative.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's a pile of money. Holy jumping. Yeah. Wow. Do you do bankruptcy consulting here? Wow, it's just, that boggles my mind. It really does. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, that $117 million we talked about to maintain the is a lot of money to maintain that proposed level of service. And, you know, the benchmark was the 245 million, so
And that's just keeping the level of service we have now.
the 117
Yeah,
million
Yeah.
dollars in total
Yeah.
costs, over 10
Okay.
years. Deputy Mayor?
Just to respond to Councillor Wickens, if you consider the fact that every resident is a partial owner of the municipality, collectively, we're almost a billionaire.
Member Queen, Member Queen, have you had any questions? We're
Well, the one thing I was going to say is this is a report coming and we have to pass this by July 1st, but I just was thinking that is that possibility in that report that report go to the public and we have a public meeting on all this, because this is, as you say, this is dealing with all the stakeholders in our municipality. And I think it would be good to get some feedback on their thoughts. And I don't know how you convey that, if that's been done. It's just, you know, we're the directors of the corporation, which is the municipality, but you know, the stakeholders are the ratepayers of this municipality, and you know, if there's a major change in your corporation or major concern about your corporation, sometimes you go to the public, share that information and get feedback on that as well. You know, just like you said about $1 million compounded year after year after year after year, it's something I think I know you get to the budget process, but people sometimes are in and sometimes tune out, but this is sort of something that gives you a bit of a snapshot of what we're dealing with, right? But I don't know if is that something that other municipalities have done?
Director McCarthy, did you want to respond to that?
I mean, our council meetings are public, but I'm just saying in a sense of a forum that more specifies or specific to this report or reports coming.
Through you, Chair Elwood, some municipalities did do public consultation specifically regarding the proposed levels of service. It was decided not to do that at this point in the process or to inform this plan based on the fact that we felt that we've done extensive consultation in the last several years with the public surrounding what they want to see in regards to recreation specifically. We've also had plans come before council for our facilities, our roads, our bridges. So I don't feel that any of this is new information. It's updated information, but it has been part of the story for the last several budget years. So we're certainly always open to receiving feedback, but I think we've also received clear indication regarding what service levels the public is looking for.
Thank you, Director McCarthy. I think it's fair to say that, you know, we're going to get a report that we've got to submit by July the 1st, but we've had previous reports and recommended rate increases that the council of the day made decisions on during the budget process where there's lots of public consultation.
Well, just a follow up to that. I mean, just roughly on the numbers here, you know, to maintain an increase of 4.5%, you know, minimum, you know, over the next 10 years, and a 5.5% of water and wastewater. I don't know if you've been listening to the news, but the part that people are missing payments on their credit cards or missing payments on their mortgages is up. My whole point is you sort of go out with that number to say, look, if this is, you know, what we have to do, it's the reality of what we're dealing with. I don't know, like, certainly, you think people in a coffee shop talk about your asset management plan? I bet you none of them all have a clue what you're talking about in the most sense. I just say that, you know, this is sort of the reality that, you know, that we're at the point of service levels decision. Obviously, when it gets back to your budget meeting, you know, you're going to have this conversation of what's going to be proposed at budget time to be putting into your asset management reserve. It's just that, you know, I just think that it needs to be shared more in the sense of this is just bringing all that information back together, but that's just my comment, Mr. Chair.
Okay, that was just a comment. Go ahead, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Owen. Just to Mayor McQueen. I think residents may not realize they're talking about asset management, but I could bet you $1,000,000 that if you go to a coffee shop, they're gonna be talking about a pothole on a road or the arena that we have or what they want to get fixed. I do have a question to what Mayor McQueen is saying, but I say Paul McQueen, my apologies. To what Mayor McQueen is saying, we're seeing in this report that we have to have our next AMP passed by July 1st. If we don't, I guess the question is, what's the consequence if we're delayed in getting the AMP passed? And I'm not saying not pass one. I'm saying if we delay for the purposes of having an asset management conversation before, sorry, not an asset management, sorry, having a level of service conversation before the asset management plan comes forward and approved, because you know we have to have that in place. But can Director McCarthy kind of answer that question? What's the penalty or the issue with not getting it passed? And then would that give us time to have a level of service discussion, be it a public level service discussion, if that's what the mayor is wishing to do?
Thank you. Through you, I'll answer that, and then maybe Christopher would like to speak to it. I think the risk would be to our grant funding. So there might be a delay in receiving some of our gas tax or OSIF funds if it's not approved by the deadline. Also, I just want to reiterate that the asset management plan is really prepared as at a point in time. So I think it is accurate as of all the decisions that council has made to date. So if council decides in July to drastically change levels of service one way or the other, then the plan is already shifting, right? So, and that can be reflected for either through another plan update or during budget deliberations, we can take that into account. So it doesn't have to be the perfect plan at this point in time. It's just based on the best data available.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to what we haven't seen a particular or specific consequence of not meeting the requirement. We definitely don't want to encourage you to miss that regulatory deadline. I would certainly encourage that you meet that. To your point, a lot of the grant funding requires submission of the asset management plan. How they use it, how they review it, we don't really know. They have a way that they do these things, but it is a requirement of one of the things they want to see as part of that exercise as well.
And again, I would echo those concerns. The you know, the funding gap is not unique to Grey Highlands. This asset management plan issue, especially in small rural communities, but in all of the municipalities in Ontario, you know, your work with Roma and AMO, they're lobbying hard for the province to step up and look for some, not a lottery where you're looking for grants, but that we're asking, or the provincial government, AMO is asking the provincial government to look for sustainable, reliable funding sources to maintain these asset management plans. It's a cost that, you know, can't be put solely on our ratepayers. You know, some of our councillors today have expressed that concern, but you know, I believe having a plan in place is it's sort of like having engineering studies in place when you're going for funding on bridge replacement and things like that. If you don't have those, if you're not ready for it, you're not going to be eligible for some of these funding opportunities. And I suspect there will be funding opportunities beyond perhaps what's being considered today. Mayor McQueen.
So going back to I think it's advantageous that we do fix those potholes because you're maintaining your asset. That's maintenance. I think going back to what Councillor Allen was saying, maintenance. So, you know, the asset is looking at replacing that asset. But I think we also need a plan that looks at how do we maintain properly our assets in a sense of, are we doing what we need to do? Are we reactive or proactive? And I think there's something to be said, like if you have your vehicle that's being scheduled for every 5,000 kilometers for your oil change, that's being proactive. Versus, oh, it's out of oil, better put some oil on it. No, I'm serious. That's the two different sides, like, you know, on a roof or whatever, you know, like if a roof's getting rusty, get it painted before it gets rusty. Like do we have that plan in place? Because, you know, if you can maintain, like on my dad's roof, it's been on there since 1904. It's still a original roof, but it's been painted and screwed down and maintained. Would a new roof look good on that? Absolutely, but it's maintained and so, you know, so how do we preserve the life of these assets in the best way we can? You know, it's, you know, that, but going back to the point of the 4.5% and 5%, you know, sure, if you have your general public saying, okay, I want this and want that, yeah, that's okay. But are you prepared to have a 10% increase for the next 20, 10, whatever? Well, we have to complete the whole story. And that's the whole part about on the public side, they want this, they want that, want this. And I think, you know, generally we see what's going on and that's where, you know, our facilities and having more involvement with MOUs and stuff is a whole different conversation. But it's just, you know, I think we have to sit down and think about outside the box thinking on maintaining and do we have checklists? Do we have, you know, schedule? Do we have that kind of stuff? And I'm sure we do to a certain degree, but also, you know, you can't help if you have a heavy, you know, 80 to 110 km/h wind, it blows your roof up. We have insurance, but you know, there's all that part as well. So I think in a sense of running a business, I look at the municipality as running a business, and so we have to look at all the possibilities that we can use to do the best thing. And that's why we're here. And that's what I was saying about the public. It's just it's not in the sense of getting input, but it's also feedback and communication. A lot of people don't, you know, they you know, even for ourselves to the degree of stuff that we, you know, we get fired at us, and you know, we struggle sometimes, I think, in the sense of getting our head around what we have to manage, but we manage. That's our job. But it's the communication that's so important, and getting that feedback and understanding of why things cost so much. And people know, and I know out of COVID, I think the building index, you know, shot up. One was supply and demand of contractors and a lot of other things that outside of our, you know, ability. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts here, and I'll just leave it at that, Mr. Chair. But I just think in the sense of the public side, and certainly we have a plan, we can adopt it for July 1st for sure, but it doesn't mean we can't stop talking about it or communicating what that means and how that works. And I mean, we have an individual here that's writing down, you know, carefully reporting through a press point, but you know, like they always say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't get it to drink. How do we communicate this? We do it in our tax notices. Like, I mean, we have to continue to communicate stuff that we're getting as well. So anyway, thank you.
I mean, that life cycle activity on slide 10, it's not just, you know, it talks about maintenance, it talks about expansion, it talks about disposal, it talks about policy changes to lower the costs of managing asset lives.
Well, that's the other thing.
There's it's not just contributing to reserve funds.
And I know the deputy mayor has talked about, you know, about Fort Renas and stuff like that, and it's looking after that as well as a cost. But you know, the focus is more on here is roads and bridges, and I know some municipalities have looked at closing roads or bridges for bridges repair, but you know, that has rippling effects as well. I know that you know, thinking outside the box with bridge repair, you know, is there opportunities there? Maybe, but it all comes back to the liability as well. And we see our insurance keeps going up because of the liability of that. You know, we have to maintain, and we have to, you know, and we're held at a higher level of standard because of that, of all the aspects around the, you know, if something goes wrong and all that. So I don't know, you know, maybe there's that at some point, maybe we need to have that further conversation at the level of service where we need to maybe get public feedback, but we got to provide all the information in order to put everything on the table to have that conversation. And not just today, but the next 20 years too, because, you know, when others are around this table, you know, and, you know, on the other side of tax increases, we haven't been at it. You know, there's municipalities that have frozen their taxes. Well, that hasn't been beneficial either because they're way behind it, you know. But, you know, there's pressure on that part of real estate and taxation and stuff. And he always used to say, a barometer of that is your tax arrears. When your tax arrears starting to increase, then that's usually an indication that, you know, there's issues there as well. And I think we've been sort of holding our own in that sense. So it's a big issue, and you know.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Mayor McQueen. It's coming up on 10:30. I mean, if we're going to extend the meeting or if we're close to wrapping it up, if we're going to continue the meeting, I think we should take a break. But if not, if we feel that we're coming to an end of today's discussions, we'll keep going and adjourn. But Deputy Mayor?
I'll move the motion that the committee receive the 2025 asset management plan presentation for information.
Seconded by Councillor Allen. Any further comments, questions, or discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much for your presentation today and staff, as always. Difficult decisions, but that's our job. Deputy Mayor.
Motion to adjourn.
Do we need to second that and vote on that? Seconded by Councillor Allen. All in favor? Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.